mom's surgery this week, and there may still be others. I'm not sure. Is there an update on Audrey today?
I guess they're going to send her home tomorrow because she has to have some more chemo.
Okay, we're going to send her home tomorrow. All right, let's open our Bibles together to the book of Judges and the 9th chapter. Are you able to hear me okay? A rather strange and awful story, actually, about a man named Abimelech. It is a story that is unique in the book of Judges. Abimelech actually was not a judge in the sense as we have defined that term. He was a man who was more of a renegade than anything else. So some have asked, well, why is this included in the book of Judges, this story about the man? The answer to that is probably at least threefold. First of all, it gives us some insight as to the extent of Baal worship in that part of Palestine this time. Baal was a part of the pantheon of the Canaanites. He was the son of El, who was their head god. And his name still is retained today over in that area. Some of you have perhaps been to the ruins in Lebanon called Baalbek, which I think is inaccessible anymore because of the war there. But the name is still retained today, and we'll see it in tonight's lesson as well. Secondly, the story gives us the conditions that existed in central Israel during this period of time. Most of the stories in Judges take place in the northern part of Palestine or in the southern part. This hits right in the middle, and it tells us what it was like there. It also gives to us early on an expression of the tendency on the part of the people of Israel toward a monarchy, showing us that they wanted a king to rule over them. They were not satisfied. They were not content with a theocracy, the rule of God. They wanted the rule of one king. And this gives us an example. Though it's a limited number of people involved in a limited geographical area, it still shows us that that was the heart's desire. It says, and Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives. Back up a few verses to chapter 8 and look at verse 31. Jerubbaal is, of course, another name for Gideon. And it says in verse 31, his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. And so now we have a little bit of understanding as to the origin of Abimelech. He is the son of a slave woman. And she lived in the city of Shechem, so that's where her relatives were from. That's why Shechem is so important in what happens in chapter 9. This was his home turf, so to speak. His name also is interesting because Abimelech means his father is king. Now, Gideon had been offered the kingship and had refused it. And yet he went on to live like a king in wealth and with a lot of wives and concubines. And so even the naming of his son suggests to us that while he refused the title, he nonetheless rather enjoyed that image. His father is king. And perhaps because he grew up with that name, Abimelech is early on tempted toward becoming the next king, or the first king, actually, of Israel. And Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem, to his mother's relatives, and spoke to them and to the whole clan of the household of his mother's father, saying, speak now in the hearing of all the leaders of Shechem. Which is better for you, that 70 men, all the sons of Jerubbaal, rule over you, or that one man rule over you? So he's giving them a choice. He says, would you rather have 70 people to give tribute to and to honor as king, or as many kings, or would you rather just have one? And then he goes on to say, oh, by the way, remember that I'm your bone and your flesh. And so he presents to them an alternative. The implication seems to be here that somebody's about to rule over you. Now, whether that was true or not, we don't know. Gideon was dead by this time. Were his sons, in fact, planning to put themselves in a position of ruling over the nation? That is the implication. That's what Abimelech at least wanted them to think. And they were Israelites. And he was half Canaanite. And so who would they rather have rule over them? These 70 Jews, or one who was at least partially like them? And his mother's relatives spoke these words in his behalf in the hearing of all the leaders of Shechem. And so they took this message back to all the people who lived there. And the people who lived in Shechem were both Israelite and Canaanite. There was a mixture. And they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our relative. He's partly like us, at least. And so they gave him 70 pieces of silver from the house of Baal Berith. Means the Lord of the covenant. This was a temple, a place of worship of these pagan gods there in the city of Shechem. They took some money out of the church treasury. You understand my revised perversion there, out of the treasury of this temple. And with that, Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows, and they followed him. The worthless and reckless fellows is an idiomatic expression that refers to people who are ruffians. They were hooligans. They were thugs. They were worth nothing. They just got into trouble. And so with this money that was given to him from the temple, he hired a band of worthless guys who then were going to carry out what he wanted them to do. And what did he want them to do? They went to Ophrah, which was not far away, and they killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. That expression seems to mean that it was a public massacre. We have here a mass murder of all the sons of Gideon, save one. Because almost parenthetically it says there at the end of verse 5, but Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. So somehow he was able to escape this massacre of Gideon's family and was able to preserve his life. And it says, all the men of Shechem and all Beth Milo assembled together. Beth Milo means the house of the fill, and probably is referring to as we would say today, a suburb of Shechem, where some wealthy people live. The house of the fill probably refers to an area that had been filled in with something, and on that platform or that foundation of fill dirt, they built their houses. And this is where some of the more wealthy or the more influential people apparently lived. And they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar, which was in Shechem. Now this is interesting. Turn back to Joshua 24 for a moment. Here we have Joshua's final charge to the people of Israel. And he says to them, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Who are you going to serve? And it says in verse 24, and the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God, and we will obey his voice. And so he made a covenant with the people that day, and made for them a statute and an ordinance in Shechem. That's where that all took place, in this very city. And he wrote the words of the book of the law of God. He took a large stone and set it under the oak that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. This is the same place where years later Abimelech is named the king of Israel. And so we have a little bit of a cross-reference there on this location. It was very meaningful in Israel's history. It's where Joshua led the people in recommitting themselves to God, and was there that he buried the covenant, and there they honored the Lord. It was at that place that they chose then to name Abimelech as this renegade king. Now the news of all this got to Jotham, and Jotham decided to take some action. He was the only son of Gideon who was left. And so he went to the area of Shechem, to a mountainside that was not far from there at all. In fact, it was right outside the city. And it's Mount Gerizim on the south side of the city. Mount Ebal is on the north side, and you may recall that when the people of Israel entered into the promised land, they went to this place, and there they recited the blessings of the law on Mount Gerizim and the curses of the law on Mount Ebal. That was part of the ceremony. And it was to remind them of the blessings that God would pour on them if they obeyed, and the curses that would come upon them if they disobeyed His law. And it's interesting that even today, Mount Gerizim is a mountain that has green growing on it. There's life there. Mount Ebal, just across the briefest of valleys, is barren as can be, just rock. The blessings and the cursings of the law. Well, it is to Mount Gerizim now that Jotham goes. And he goes there because this area is sort of like a natural amphitheater in the sense that his voice would carry for a good distance, and that's what he wanted. This is not a tall mountain as though you were going up thousands of feet. It's only a few hundred feet high, but because of his situation, his voice would carry. And he gave to them what is an example of a fable as a story form. By fable, we mean that inanimate or animate nature is given a name, is given identity, is given personality, and then a story is woven around that. This story form became the parabolic form, the parable that Jesus used so much. In this particular case, the very first use in the Bible of this parable-type statement, he says, "Listen to me, O men of Shechem, that God may listen to you." By that he probably means, now you listen to me, so that God can hear what you're going to say in response to what I have to say. He wasn't going to stay around for their response, because his life would be in danger. And he took off as soon as he got finished saying this. But he says, you listen to me, and God will hear what you have to say in response. Once the trees went forth to anoint a king over them. And they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my fatness with which God and men are honored and go to wave over the trees? In other words, the olive tree said, no thanks. Then the tree said to the fig tree, you come, reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go to wave over the trees? He said, no thanks. Then the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my new wine, which cheers men, God and men, and go to wave over the trees? So these first three trees are trees of produce, trees that were important in Israel. We talk about the fig tree and the vine and the olive tree producing the olive oil. You're talking about three very important products in Israel. All of these valuable trees said, no, we don't want to rule over you. Finally, all the trees said to the bramble, to the thorn bush, you come and reign over us. And the thorn bush said to the trees, if in truth you are anointing me as king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. Now there's a bit of sarcasm there. You know how much shade the thorn bush has? But if not, may fire come out from the bramble and consume the cedars of Lebanon. Well, interesting statement. Now therefore, if you have dealt in truth and integrity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jeroboam and his house, and have dealt with them as he deserved, down to verse 19. If then you've dealt in truth and integrity with Jeroboam and his house this day, says Jotham, rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. But if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and consume the men of Shechem and Beth Milo. And let fire come out from the men of Shechem and Beth Milo and consume Abimelech. Now we skipped over the verses that tell how worthy Gideon and his family was of honor. They have in fact been mistreated by these people. Now Jotham in this parable and in its interpretation tells us that the people of Shechem chose the thorn bush an unworthy man, Abimelech, a disastrous leader, to be their king. And he places a curse upon those people. That hardly seems important to us today in our thinking, but let me tell you that curses are very real. And here, Jotham stands before the people. He places a curse on them. He says, now, if you treated Gideon and his family with respect, fine. But if you didn't, and they didn't, then let fire come out from him and destroy you, and let fire come out from you and destroy him. Well, we're going to see how that was fulfilled. Jotham escaped and fled and went to Beer, which means a well, nobody knows where that is, and remained there because of Abimelech, his brother. So he's off the stage now. And we go back to Abimelech. Well, Abimelech ruled 3 years. Apparently he did not live in Shechem. He lived elsewhere. Because Abimelech had appointed a man that we'll meet in a moment to be his lieutenant, so to speak, in the city of Shechem. Now, verse 23 is an interesting verse. It says, then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. Now, there are those who take this to mean that God caused an evil attitude to develop. That feelings went sour. And it could mean that. But if we take it literally for what it says, it seems to suggest that God here sent a demon, which is what literally it means. God sent a demon to create trouble between Abimelech and Shechem. Now, does this strike you as being odd? Well, of course it does all of this. It seems out of character for God to do this. Is there any other occasion in the Bible where we see something like this happen? Yeah, with Saul. God sent a spirit to plague Saul. You say, well, how do you justify this? How do you rationalize God doing this? And of course, God doesn't need any explanation from me, or from you for that matter. God can do what he wants to do. He is sovereign. The suggestion, though, is that what likely happened was that God simply allowed this to take place. It wasn't that God is here condoning an evil spirit, that God is somehow in charge of that evil spirit, except that ultimately God is sovereign over all things, isn't he? Even evil spirits. And here God, apparently, sent this evil spirit as an act of his sovereign will and allowance, and this spirit began to cause division between Abimelech and the people who had named him king. They began to deal treacherously with Abimelech, which means they broke their agreement with him. What did they do this for? Or why did God do this, rather? In verse 24 it says, in order that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbabel might come, and their blood be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. So God is going to allow vengeance to take place upon these people. And that's part of the reason for this attitude being developed, and this spirit working that attitude. And the men of Shechem set men in ambush against him, Abimelech, on the tops of the mountains, and they robbed all who might pass by them along the road. And it was told to Abimelech. And what the situation is that the Shechem is located in a very vital commercial route. All the caravans going north and south would pass through Shechem in central Palestine. And those caravans that would be going from the Mediterranean coast inland to the Dead Sea and beyond would likewise pass through Shechem. So it was a heavily commercialized area, lots of caravan traffic. And Abimelech had been taking advantage of that. And now the people of Shechem go to these caravans first, and they exact a toll or a tax, as it were, from them, so that that money isn't now going to Abimelech. It's not supporting him any longer in his tyranny. But the men of Shechem are enriching themselves. And so when he dealt treacherously with them, that's what it's talking about. they began to rob these people on the caravans to deprive Abimelech of his revenue. But now we're introduced in verse 26 to another individual. His name is Gaal, the son of Ebed, who came with his relatives and crossed over into Shechem. Now, this man seems to have been a Canaanite again, and so he was right at home in the city that was largely Canaanite. And it says that the men of Shechem put their trust in him. He began to work the crowds. He apparently was aware of the situation with Abimelech, and so he began to foster their loyalty to himself. And they went out into the field and gathered grapes for their vineyards and held a festival. This was a pagan festival. And from what we know, the Canaanite festivals, it was a drunken sexual orgy. It's what it amounted to. And they went to the house of their god, and they ate and drank and cursed Abimelech. And this man, Gaal, replied this to them very shrewdly: "Who is Abimelech? And who is Shechem, that we should serve him?" He's saying, does Abimelech fit with Shechem? No. Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, who is Jewish? And is Zebul not his lieutenant? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him? Does anybody know who Hamor is? You find his name all the way back in the book of Genesis. Hamor was a Canaanite who lived in Shechem. And in fact, the name Shechem is named after his son, Shechem. And it means shoulder. Hamor, of course, had long now been dead. But what this man is saying, look, don't you think that you ought to serve the descendants of Hamor, the great leader of Shechem? Why should you serve this guy who's a half-breed? This man Abimelech, whose father's a Jew? Should you not serve the traditional ancestry of Hamor and his descendants? And then he goes on to say, would therefore that this people were under my authority. Then I would remove Abimelech. It sounds just like our elections every 4 years. Oh, that you would follow our party. And he says to them, oh, that I could rule over you. I would get rid of this guy, Abimelech. And he said to Abimelech, increase your army and come out. He gave a public challenge and taunt to Abimelech. He says, come on and fight. Get your army out there and let's fight, Abimelech. Now, was this man drunk as he says these things? We don't know what his state of mind was. But the fact is that he was issuing a challenge to Abimelech, and these words did not go unheeded. There was this lieutenant whose name was Zebul, who was the ruler of the city. And he heard these words, and he got really mad about it. He was very shrewd in what he did. Before the people could really respond to the words and the challenge of Gaal, he sent a message to Abimelech. And the message is in verses 31, 32, and so on. He says, behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, his relatives have come to Shechem. Behold, they're stirring up the city against you. Now therefore arise by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field. And it shall come about in the morning as soon as the sun is up. You shall rise early and rush upon the city, and behold, when he and the people who are with him shall come out against you, you shall do to them whatever you can. So he gets this covert message out to Abimelech. And Abimelech gets the message, and he and his people then come to the city, and they lay wait. And notice that he follows some of the pattern of his father, Gideon. He divides his company up here into 4 groups. And Gaal went out and stood at the entrance of the city gate. This is morning now. Abimelech and all the people who were with him arose from the ambush. So as they looked out, he saw this movement. That was early in the morning. And Zebul said, don't worry. Or rather, Gaal said, look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains. He's just seeing shadows there, but he thinks he sees people moving. Zebul plays dumb. And he says, oh no, those are just the shadows, this is the morning. You just think they're people. And time passes, and Gael spoke again. He says, behold, people are coming down from the highest part of the land, and one company comes by way of the diviner's oak. Now Zebul says to him, well, where's your boasting now, with which you said, who is Abimelech that we should serve him? Is this not the people whom you despise? Go out now and fight them. And so earlier on, Gael had been the one taunting. Now Zebul, Abimelech's lieutenant, does some taunting. He goads Gael to get out there and fight. You said you were going to do it. You're going to make a fool of yourself. And so Gael went out before the leaders of Shechem. We're not sure whether that means that the leaders of Shechem went out with him, or he and his band went out and the leaders watched. Probably the latter. And the fight took place. Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. And Abimelech remained at Arumah, which was nearby, but Zebul drove out Gael and his relatives so that they could not remain in Shechem. In other words, Zebul arranged that the leaders of Shechem would chase out Gael and what remained of his renegade army. They didn't allow them to stay in the city. And they thought that this would surely please Abimelech. And that's why on the next day, the people went to the field. They said, surely Abimelech's going to appreciate the fact that we didn't allow these people to remain in our city. We chased them off. And they went out to the field, and Abimelech was told that, and he took his people and divided them into 3 companies and lay in wait in the field. And when he looked and saw the people coming out from the city, he arose against them and slew them. So these were unarmed people from Shechem who were going out to the field to do their work. And he fell upon them, and there was a great slaughter. And it says that he and his company who was with him dashed forward, stood at the entrance of the city gate. The other 2 companies then dashed against all who were in the field and slew them. They cut off their retreat. They came in from the sides and slaughtered all those who went to the field. And Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he captured the city and killed the people who were in it. Then he razed the city, tore it down, and sowed it with salt. Archaeologists have confirmed that, in fact, at this particular time, the city was just exactly like this. It says, destroyed. The sowing with salt was it was a ritual, the symbolic act showing that this land forever now would be unusable. It's cursed. And it says, when the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard of it, they entered the inner chamber of the temple of El-Berith. Now, we've seen this name Baal-Berith before. Here it's changed to El-Berith, El being the chief god, Baal being his son. Same place, though. The Tower of Shechem is probably the same as Beth Milo, the house of Phil. But out there in that part of the city, in the suburban area, they had built this fortress-like thing, this tower, in which the leaders of the city, those who were the wealthy and who lived down in that region, they hid inside this tower. And apparently as a part of this tower, there was this temple called the El-Berith, the God of the Covenant. And it was told Abimelech that the leaders were out there hiding and gathered together, and so he sent up to Mount Solomon, a hill nearby, and he and the people who were with him, and they chopped down some wood, and they brought it back on their shoulders. Interesting, that's the word Shechem. They brought the wood back on their shoulders. And he says, what you've seen me do, hurry and do likewise. And the people did exactly as he did. They started the fire, and the result of the fire was the smoke or the fire killed 1,000 men and women. And so again, we see this tremendous loss of life because of Abimelech's tyranny. Let me ask you a question at this point that is worth thinking about. What does this activity on the part of Abimelech, his hot pursuit and his indiscriminate killing of people, tell you about his mental state? What's happened to this man?
He's deranged.
Okay. Okay. Remember, there is an evil spirit that is at work here. He has mentally degenerated, deranged perhaps would be a word for him. He has had the taste of blood in Shechem as he killed Gael, or killed the forces of Gael. Then he goes for the whole city, destroys it, destroys all of its leaders. It rather reminds me of the leader of Iraq, a man who is just possessed, who's using your word, who's deranged, who is murderous, and can't seem to stop. Then we see that and what happens next. Abimelech went to Thebez. That's about 10 miles to the northeast. He camped against Thebez and captured it. But there was a strong tower in the center of the city, and all the men and women with all the leaders of the city fled there and shut themselves in. They went up to the roof of the tower. And so he was going to pull the same thing all over again. They went inside their fortress tower, protect themselves, and in this case they went up to the roof of the tower. Abimelech came to the tower and fought against it, and approached the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire. Worked once, it'll work again. But a certain woman threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head, crushing his skull. And she was up there in the tower, this little millstone, 10 inches long, so to speak, weighed several pounds. It wasn't a gigantic millstone. She just took it over there and dropped it as he was lighting the fire and hit him right in the head. And it crushed his skull. Talk about Excedrin headache. He called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, lest it be said of me, a woman slew him." That was his biggest concern at this point. He's dying. He doesn't want to die having it said that a woman killed him. And so the young man pierced him through, and he died. Now turn over to 2 Samuel 11 for just a moment. Here's some irony. 2 Samuel is different from 1 Samuel, isn't it? Yes. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 21. We can't explain the whole context here. This has to do with David and his arrangements to have Uriah killed. But just notice what it says in verse 21. And if it happens that the king's wrath rises, the 20 says, he says to you, why did you go so near to the city to fight? Why did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Why did you get so close to the wall? Who struck down Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Another name from Gideon. Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? So why did you go so near the wall? So he's warning about getting so close to the wall. And you see, even hundreds of years later, it still said a woman killed him. So it didn't do a bit of good what he did. Here's a man who's dying. Now let's just back off from the character of this man. Let's understand that here's a human being who is dying. There's no way for his life to be saved. He's suffering. And he says to somebody else, by the way, this sword bearer's name, this armor bearer's name was Kevorkian. And he says to him, kill me. Kill me. And he did it. So do we have here a biblical precedent for euthanasia? For killing someone who's about to die anyway? Isn't that the merciful thing to do? So Kevorkian's right. Right? No, we wouldn't agree with Kevorkian, and this, although it is sometimes referred to more commonly as Saul's request, which is the same, his armor bearer refused to do it. So Saul killed himself, which is more like Kevorkian method. But in these examples, we don't have some kind of foundation for euthanasia. Nowhere is this commended by God There is no verse that supplements these accounts to indicate that this was good, that God's approval was on this. It's simply telling us what happened. Okay? So that it can't be used as proof for euthanasia, which is detestable. And when the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, each departed to his home. Thus God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father in killing his 70 brothers. Also God returned all the wickedness of the men of Shechem on their heads, and the curse of Jotham, the son of Jeroboam, came upon them. Remember the curse? Let fire go out from him and destroy you. Let fire go out from you and destroy him. And so all of these people now have fallen under the curse of Jotham. Let's talk about Jotham for just a quick moment. What are the admirable qualities that you see in this surviving son of Gideon? Courage. How do you see that?
That's some guts. I'd be scared to take 2 words to one of those people I know stand on the rooftop and walk them on.
He was a very courageous individual. He was a valiant man to have done that. What kind of a tone of voice do you think that he had as he spoke to them? Do you think that he was angry? That he was fearful? That he was sarcastic? What kind of a tone of voice did he have as he spoke to the people of Shechem?
He must have been very conflicted because God honored the person he placed on that. He got it from God, and God wasn't going to carry out the will of God.
God was pleased to do that, wasn't he?
I mean, it's prophetic.
Mhm. I'm sorely tempted to give you an illustration of this. And I will, in kind of general terms. A few weeks ago, we had a special prayer meeting, and we spent an evening praying that God would deliver us from curses of a satanic group here in the city that was angry at us. And we prayed not only that God would deliver us from the curses. Do you remember how else we prayed that night? Protection. Protection for the girl we're seeking to help. We prayed that the curse would fall back on the heads of those who sent it. We prayed that on Sunday night, as I recall, wasn't it? Halloween Sunday night. And we prayed that. That afternoon, I had received a call from my sister in Kansas telling me that she had been in an accident the night before in Kansas. And that she and her daughter had escaped without serious injury, but that she had totaled their car, totaled the truck that she hit that pulled across the road in front of them. And I had praised God that they were safe, and just sort of filed it away. In my mind, it's something to give thanks to God for. And what I'm going to tell you next, I cannot prove, but I am convinced in my own heart that it is true. The next day I got a call from the girl that we had prayed for and sought to help. And she said, oh, by the way, my father's sister, her father is the leader of this coven. She says, my father's sister died yesterday. I said, oh, really? She says, yes. I said, well, tell me about it. Oh, she was a witch. And I thought, wow, that's something. Here's Halloween. A witch the telephone, I began to think. My sister should have died Saturday night. His sister died Sunday. And so I called up our friend and I said, tell me some more about this aunt of yours. So she shared some more about the aunt. That, in fact, on that Halloween, she had been in a witch's circle. And they were doing their chants and their incantations, and they were involved in throwing curses upon their enemies, including the people helping this girl we've been helping. And the aunt, who was the head of this witch's circle, was standing in a circle because their pagan mythology is that if they stand in this circle, they can throw curses at their enemies and conjure up all of these spirits, and they can't be hurt. And while she was standing in that circle, in the witch's circle, casting curses, God struck her dead. And I want to tell you something. That sent a message. That sent a message that only God could send. So when we see things like this in Judges chapter 9, and God tells us that what happened was the fulfillment of what Jotham had said, and the curse that he had placed on those people, we need to understand that these are not casual words. And I believe that God, in his own sovereign way, answered our prayers in allowing the curses that were sent toward us to fall back on the heads of those who were doing that. Now, I hope that doesn't scare you. What it does to me is to say we serve a great God. We serve a God who answers prayer. We serve a God who is pleased to work on our behalf and to see after our welfare. And we can trust him with everything we have and all that we are. That's the kind of a God he is. Great is thy faithfulness. Now I would ask you not to spread that story around. You think I can trust you with that? That's not the kind of story you want to get widely circulated for a lot of reasons. But I felt led to share it with you tonight to illustrate some of what we're dealing with here. And that God is a God who is sovereign. And God is a God who will judge the ungodly in his way and in his time. And I go back to the words of Deborah in the song that she wrote. And she was talking about Sisera. You remember, he's the guy that also had a bad headache. The tent peg went right through his temple into the ground. The enemy of the Lord, he was dead on the spot. And she said, and let all of the enemies of the Lord be like Sisera. And I say amen to that. And let the righteous rise like the sun in its strength. And if tonight you know Jesus Christ and you're one of those who belong to him, realize that that's what is true about your life. Poetically speaking, you're rising like the sun in its strength. And God is with you, and if God before you, who can be against you? You're his people. Don't ever take that lightly or take it for granted. Blessings. Good night. God bless you.